Great. All right. So, welcome to everyone. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kma'ki people who have been here for over 11,000 years. And also to recognize our African Nova Scotian people who have been here for more than 400 years. And all of us contributing to a treaty of peace and friendship. So, welcome everyone. So glad to be here today, virtually, but recognizing we are in Mi'kma'ki. We have two presenters today, Maddie Gallant and Ivan Beck, both PhD candidates, and I know a little bit about each of their work, so I'm thrilled to have both of you here today. And I believe, Maddie, you're scheduled to present first, and then Ivan, and probably about 25 minutes each when we do end at 1 o'clock, and everything will be recorded so people can watch this afterwards. So welcome to everyone. So Maddie, do you want to share your screen? And I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Can you see that
Yes.
screen now? And is
Yes.
it just the slideshow?
Yes,
Just
just
the
like that.
slideshow.
And does it go forward if I do that?
Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan, and thank you for having me here today to share a little bit about my PhD dissertation. So I'm Maddie Gallant. I'm a PhD candidate at Dalhousie in the School of Nursing, and I'm also an assistant professor at Acadia Expansion Site, which is a satellite site of Cape Breton University, and a perinatal nurse consultant with the Reproductive Care Program of Nova Scotia with IWK Health. So I wear a couple of different hats that I bring to my research and clinical practice, but very proud of all of them. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you one of the three result manuscripts that I have within my dissertation. I picked this one just because I think it's very interesting and also gives an opportunity to kind of showcase the use of frameworks within qualitative research, which sometimes can be a bit of a sticky point. And so I wanted to share that with you folks today. And as Megan mentioned, I'm gathered here. I'm actually in the Valley, but also in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I really encourage and always myself, I'm constantly thinking about can I advance equity and consider the continued inequities that are faced by Indigenous communities within our communities and in our learning space. And so, and throughout, my dissertation and throughout everything that I do, I always try to apply that lens of considering, okay, what does this mean? How is this impacting Indigenous populations? And then also potentially what gaps exist and how can we address those gaps through education, through policy, and through research. And as Megan mentioned, we are also in a province that is deeply enriched by the contributions of the African Nova Scotian people. And again, another population that continues to face inequities in our province and, the health system and education and beyond. And so again, very similarly with Indigenous populations, continuing to consider how can I advance equity for these populations through an intentional and responsive approach and in being a critical ally as well and my responsibility in action-oriented changes. And so to provide a little bit of a background, so I'm a perinatal nurse consultant, but my background is very much a perinatal nurse and caring for pregnant persons diagnosed with substance use disorder and their newborns who are experiencing neonatal withdrawal. And these families experience complexities within their care, really stemming from the continued inequities that they face and also systemic barriers and stigma and discrimination that exists within the healthcare system and society. And historically, we used what's called the Finnegan's Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome Scoring Tool. And what that was is it was a tool that was very much embedded in a medicalized approach. It looked at the symptoms of newborns and how they were experiencing withdrawal, rather than focusing holistically on what was the newborn function, how were they functioning in the withdrawal. And so in 2017, Grossman and colleagues developed what's called the Eat, Sleep, Console model of care. And this is an evidence-based intervention that really helped to address some of the complexities and the negative nuances that were found in the Finnegan score, including things like the Finnegan score was very subjective, it was invasive, and it was a lengthy assessment. And it also removed the birth parent from the center of treatment. And so the Eat, Sleep, Console very much addressed those barriers and challenges with the Finnegan score and really tried to center the care around the birth parent and looked very much at the functionality of the newborn within their withdrawal. So are they eating okay? Are they sleeping okay? And are they easily consoled? And this is largely a nurse-driven model of care. But despite, many positive impacts and effectiveness outcomes that we've seen with implementing the model, little is known about how do we actually implement it and sustain it in practice effectively. And so my larger dissertation was a mixed methods inquiry looking at implementation fidelity of the Eat, Sleep, Console model of care. So largely looking at the integrity of implementation. So what I'm presenting today, though, is part of my qualitative strand. And within my qualitative strand, I used an interpretive description methodology, and it was guided by different frameworks. And these frameworks are found in implementation science, and largely they're used to help to systematically guide how we explore a phenomenon in implementation science, but also looks at how do we create a common language so that when other places are looking at implementing the ESC model, that they see familiar terminology that can then help them pragmatically implement the ESC into practice. And so we did semi-structured interviews in Eastern Canada, and we looked at, we interviewed nurses, both RNs and LPNs at 2 healthcare facilities. And really what we sought to do was to look at how the implementation process was described at both sites. We looked at perceived barriers and facilitators to implementation. And then we also thought about we explored what strategies were used in the implementation. So again, this is just reporting on one kind of subset of the larger interpretive description study that we had within the even larger mixed methods study. But this was the focus of this particular results paper. And so when we look at objective 1, which is looking at the implementation process and how it was described at both sites, the interpretive description themes that we found were about the origin of transition, the pre-implementation phase, and a phased approach. And so when we look at the origin of transition, what we found was that when it was nurse-led, so when nurses were leading the change in practice, so from the Finnegans to the Eat, Sleep, Console, it was welcomed with little hesitancy from nurses. And this seems to be actually intertwined with the pre-implementation period. And so when there was a robust pre-implementation period that included things like prolonged engagement, seeking feedback from direct care nurses, and also just that, the talk of the time that change was coming, that there was a practice change coming. All of these kind of pieces added up to help support the implementation process and rolling out with integrity. What we did also see was that when we didn't have, if there was an absence of a robust pre-implementation period, this may be related a little bit more to resistance or hesitancy. And so those were some interesting findings that we found in the implementation process. And what we found is that at both sites that we interviewed, they both used a phased approach to implementation. So there was an exploration phase, an adoption phase, and a preparation or an implementation phase. And multiple strategies were used, which we'll see in the coming slides, to actually introduce the Eat, Sleep, Console model to practice. But what we found was that no implementation science frameworks were used. But although there was no frameworks used, there was still success in the lived experience, in using lived experience to guide how they were implementing the model. And so the only thing, though, that we really noticed was that although there was success noted in the implementation process used, there was no evidence of efforts to sustain the change in practice, which frameworks may have supported that. So that was an interesting point to note around sustainability. Then when we get into objective 2, this is where we focused more on the facilitators and the barriers that were present. And the sheer number of themes that you're going to see in the next couple of slides really demonstrate the complexities that are found within the implementation process. And in keeping with the strength-based approach that we have in nursing, we'll start with the facilitators and what the sites found as being supportive of implementing the Eat, Sleep, Console model of care. And so these are the 4 interpretive description themes that we came up with. So we have, or I should say that we conceptualized. So a welcomed healthcare innovation, who you are as a nurse matters, quality time translates to acceptance, and then education as a foundation of success. So I'll go into each one of those a little bit more to kind of help provide a little bit of context. And so first, the Eat, Sleep, Console itself as a model or a healthcare innovation was a welcomed healthcare innovation. And really, it was seen as a strength because it moved beyond labeling the newborn as the symptoms, like the Finnegans used to do, and actually cared for the family as a whole. And this really empowered families, focused on what mattered, and really addressed the challenges that were being reported with using the Finnegans. And nurses were really excited. They wanted this change. They saw the gaps that were in the Finnegans, and they wanted to have something to address those gaps. And so those were all seen as facilitators in the implementation process. Who you are as a nurse, we also found was going to impact how implementation rolled out. And so if you had experience with the Finnegan score, it actually could be seen as a facilitator because you had foundational knowledge around caring for families using the model. But a lack of experience with the Finnegans was also seen as a facilitator because people weren't biased by the outdated model. And so you didn't really have anything preconceived. You were coming in with a blank slate, and you're able to focus on what really mattered, which was if the infant was able to eat, sleep, or be consoled. Another piece that was found as a facilitator is if they had recent experience from the floor, and so especially in leadership positions. So if leaders had just been on the floor, then they had that a fresh perspective of what direct care nurses may be experiencing. And then also if nurses had comfort in caring with birth parents, again, that provided a foundation to understand, what were the gaps that were present in the Finnegans and how could the Eat, Sleep, Console address those gaps. And then finally, having dedicated support people where people could, ask questions, they could be, advocates for this change and, a positive motivation. Those were all seen as positive facilitators to implementation. And then quality of time translates to acceptance. And so this comes back to that robust pre-implementation period. It seems that the more time that nurses had with the model and being able to see the positive impacts that it had in practice, that really helped to support their acceptance of the model. Another piece was that the robust pre-implementation period allowed for change not to be surprising because that they knew the change was coming. And that was also seen as a facilitator. And then finally, education as a foundation for success. And so having, their time valued through financial contribution, so paid education training was seen as a facilitator. It was also valuable to learn with others within different networks and sites about how did they implement the ESC model. Education for staff was also important, but it was actually even more important to educate birth parents. And this was from the perspective of nurses, but what nurses found was that if they had educated birth parents on their important role within the ESC model, then birth parents really understood what their integral role was and how they could support their infant throughout the withdrawal experience. And so it was really important to have that prenatal education. And the other piece was just having dynamic education approaches. So not only was having didactic training, but also including things like train the trainer, hands-on learning opportunities were valued by nurses in the sites that we interviewed. Then, of course, there's always the potential to have some challenges in implementing something into practice. And so what we found was that environmental hurdles, inevitable complexities of nurses and birth parents, and then institutional roadblocks were the really three key interpretive description themes that we found. And so for the first one, environmental hurdles, most nurses shared how COVID-19 had impacted in one way or another throughout the implementation process. So whether it was actually deciding which strategies could be used, so in-person education versus online, or actually being able to enact the model to its full potential. So one big piece of the model is actually having the birth parent at the center of care. But of course, birth parents need to have a break. And so one of the strategies is to have, support people come in to visit in order to give the birth parent a break. But of course, in COVID-19 with visitor restrictions, that was unable to happen. And so that caused challenges in the implementation process. Another piece which was really interesting was around the lulls in admissions. And so what sites were finding was that the families weren't always presenting to the, I'm hoping that my dog doesn't bark. I'm sorry if you hear a little bark in the background. But essentially what was happening is that there would be periods of times where there would be lots of families on the unit, and then there would be a long period of time where there actually wouldn't be any families. And so one site described about how they were all ready for implementation. There was a huge buildup, everyone was ready, but then there was no families when they rolled it out. And so there was this lull between actually using the model and then actually having the education. And with that, even 5 years later now, post-implementation, there's actually some nurses that have not actually cared for families just the way, their rotations work, the way families present to the unit. And so this can be a challenge in that sustainability piece of the model in practice. There's also inevitable complexities within nurses and birth parents. So challenges exist in nurses not having any experience caring for families. One participant felt that this may compromise their ability to care for families adequately because they hadn't had the experience of caring for families before. Other participants actually felt that nurses that did have experience caring using the Finnegan score may have a hard time letting go of those symptoms. So those, 21 check boxes that we used to use all of the time, it's hard to let go of that when that's something that we've done for such a long time. Another piece was around role clarity. And so sometimes it's challenging when there was different transitions in, care. Whose role is it? So whether it was on the unit, so transitioning from unit to unit, or whether it was even transitions in leadership and just understanding whose role is it to, implement different pieces. And then some participants shared that not having comfort in caring for the population could be a challenge because families with complex histories, such as birth parents diagnosed with substance use disorder, they described as potentially the histories being intimidating in caring for families because of newer nurses not having the experience. And this was really compounded by those complex needs that birth parents may have. So then, compounding that with not being comfortable already could, again, contribute to that perpetual experience of stigma and discrimination. And so really, it just is this like intertwined cycle that was contributing to challenges in actually implementing the model. Another piece around the complex histories of birth parents is that oftentimes there was conflicting challenges, and whether that was that there was involvement of child and family well-being, or formerly known as child protective services, or there was additional responsibilities such as other children at home. All of those pieces really conflicted with being the center of treatment for newborns who are experiencing withdrawal. And so, that really challenged being able to actually implement the model into care effectively. And then the last piece around this was, again, about historical experiences of anxiety within the healthcare system of birth parents. And again, this was observed by nurses of birth parents. But what they found, or what they thought, was that having a historical negative experience with the Finnegan score potentially set families the second time that they came with, potentially just fears of, judgment, fears of pushback in care because of their negative experiences with the Finnegan score. And then finally, the last piece was around stigma and institutional roadblocks. And so nurses felt that stigma was inevitably present within the culture of the units. And this is due to the persisting stigma that's in society and the healthcare system. And so, participants shared that birth parents may be protective over their infants, and that may have led to some hesitation in actually implementing the Eat, Sleep, Console model of care. Structural availability is also a challenge, and this can be because of being short-staffed, not having the structural spaces to care for families in a newborn maternal dyad, and also just having a lack of experience in staff that's on the unit, or high staff turnover. So all of those pieces kind of were interconnected and being challenges. And then finally, another unique barrier was that nurses that weren't part of the initial rollout felt that there might be a need for additional education because they didn't get enough in orientation. And then this was further compounded by those lulls in admissions that we talked about, and how those further compound the challenges when you haven't had education for a long time. Now you haven't had enough education, and then now you have a whole, a large gap between actually caring for families. And so all those things compounded together to cause some challenges. I'm just being mindful of the time. Megan, I know we started a couple minutes late, but do you want me to stop at 12:25? Just can't see if you're nodding your head.
Oh, I had my mic off. Yeah, we just need to turn everything over to Ivan at 12:30.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm going to speed through the next couple of things then, just in case there's some questions. So the last objective was looking at different strategies. And so these strategies we grouped using the ERIC taxonomy, again, to support that development of common language. And so you can see kind of on the screen here, there was a lots of different strategies that were used for implementation. But what I want to bring to the attention is around the fact that there was no systematic processes that were used to select strategies. So strategies were mainly selected based on pre-existing experiences and knowledge, and most of them were deemed overall successful, but there were a couple of mismatches between the barriers that we identified and actually the strategies that were used, which again could potentially lead to challenges with the implementation process. And one of the ones that was kind of most highlighted as a challenge was that nurses really valued this hands-on learning, being able to try the Eat, Sleep, Console model out with families. But the train the trainer strategy wasn't sustained throughout practice, mostly due to, again, the lulls at admissions, just constraints with financial constraints. But this, again, made it hard for newer staff that didn't get enough information during orientation to then have, be on the floor and have no hands-on training. And so that was just an important point to note. What we did find, though, was that there was two strategies that were very much emphasized as being important. One was around the use of champions. And so champions had a crucial role in offering real-time guidance, providing support to nurses, and it really helped to develop this trust within this, period of potential hesitancy. And the other piece was around birth parent education. And so again, providing birth parents education prenatally really helped to support and empower them in the important role that they were going to play in the care, or the important role that they were going to have in the care for their newborn during that withdrawal period. And so in our discussion, really what we pulled from our findings was that there's this need for a systematic and theory-informed approach to implementation, largely because around the sustainability piece. So because neither site engaged in sustainability, it was clear that there were some barriers that were not addressed, which could threaten the sustainability of the model in practice. And the second piece is that there's this critical impact of a robust pre-implementation period. So especially with families who historically experience stigma and discrimination, there needs to be this robust and responsive approach to making a change within the healthcare system, because it really helps to lay the groundwork. And that's what the implementation science literature really defines this pre-implementation period as. And it's important, one of the important strategies that might help during this pre-implementation period, if you don't have a lot of time, is to have champions that can help to mitigate the potentially quantity of time in the pre-implementation period, but then also still leveraging that quality of time that would be spent in that pre-implementation period. And so I just want to acknowledge that these perspectives were all from the perspective of nurses. And so in some of the areas where we, observed that there were some challenges faced by birth parents, it's really important that we actually hear the voices of birth parents and get that first voice perspective. And so the Eat, Sleep, Console model of care is very much an interprofessional model of care. And so we really need to hear all voices, including other healthcare providers like physicians, midwives, nurse practitioners. But we especially need to hear the voices of birth parents to understand how has the implementation gone for families, and is this consistent with the way that nurses are observing, and then supporting their involvement in the implementation process. Okay, so that is it for me. Is there any questions?
Great, thank you, Maddie. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes, so anyone would like to ask a question, make a comment, now's the time.
I was interested in the theory-informed approach at the end. If you had any thoughts around what that might look like or how that could happen.
Yeah, so in healthcare, typically we use kind kind of like throw the spaghetti at the wall, see if it's going to stick. We just kind of throw whatever strategies that we can into implementing something new, just maybe what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked. But by actually using different implementation science or behavior change science frameworks, it really helps to support us in thinking throughout the whole piece. So not just the exploration, adoption, implementation, but also including that sustainability piece. So there's all kinds of different frameworks that are out there. One that I really enjoy is the knowledge to action framework, really about moving knowledge with an action-oriented approach into healthcare. And so in my practice, that's typically what I'll lean on. And that seems to help support sites in making sure that we're considering that sustainability piece and also considering those local barriers and facilitators to actually implementing change into practice. So I think it's just about changing the way that we look at implementing pieces, not pieces, but evidence-based interventions into practice, and doing it with the support of the great frameworks that are out there and adapting them based on what our needs are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan.
Yeah, because it raises a really great question. Oh, sorry, Erin, are you asking a question? I think in the chat.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I just said in the chat.
There we go. There's a question for you, Maddie. Wondering if there's anything that really surprised you about your results or analysis.
In this particular part, no. Everything was kind of consistent with what I had thought. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The lulls in admissions was actually a bit of a surprise. We see this population very much growing across the province. But the other thing that's going in tandem to the growth is that we're really trying to help support families to move back to their communities. So rather than having to go to a centralized location for care, keeping families at home and within their communities and building capacity within those facilities. And so the lulls in admissions is a bit of a surprise because historically, those families would have to travel, but hopefully the lulls in admissions mean that families are getting to stay closer to home. So it was kind of a surprising finding, but I think the depth of the impact that had not only on the confidence of nurses, but also the way in which we approach implementation was definitely a surprise. So yeah, I shouldn't say that there wasn't anything surprising. I think the depth of impact was a surprise for me in terms of the lulls of admissions.
I just want to pick up on Ivan's question because with implementation science, Maddie, as you said, there's a lot of frameworks and pieces that guide, knowledge into practice. But the theory part, I think, is what you were beginning to look at. So interpretive descriptive, like a particular type of research, like how can that be put in? Like it's a qualitative piece so you brought those nuances, which was really different. And how do you pair that? So I think your question is really important, Ivan, just that theory part. So I think you're part of that, just starting to look at that.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. It is 12:30. So thank you so much, Maddie. Great presentation and lots to think about and lots to put into practice. So I'd like to turn it over to you now, Ivan, and just to share your screen. Start whenever you're ready.
Okay. It had it like there and then it disappeared.
I know.
Of course. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So my name is Ivan Beck, and I left this page intentionally blank, just to set the tone a bit and to give you a little bit of a heads up that the spaces that I presented my work in have largely been in the context of artist talks and galleries, which is a little bit different than what you might do in the world of healthcare research, but I assure you that is the faculty that I am in. And so this is really like one of my first goes at pulling together what has been, it feels like a massive undertaking that was my dissertation that I'm still wrapping up. And so near the end, it's more, I just have a couple of points at the end, but in terms of orientating, I guess I will invite you to be curious and let whatever lands lands. And hopefully you enjoy some of what I share. So this is, I guess, in terms of a land acknowledgement, or my call to action in terms of acknowledging some of the things that are currently happening in the province. And so if you're aware of the work that's going on Hunter's Mountain on Cape Breton, and if you can support that. And then also Michelle Graveline at the Indigenous Student Center is hosting a weekly reading around the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report. And so if those are things that you wanted to kind of learn more about, those are 2 actions or ways to do that. And so we begin. We begin equipped with the best tools that we have been permitted, not knowing their full potential, their limits, or where they might direct us. We believe in them. What might it mean to live with curiosity in a world that demands certainty? It takes love to arm ourselves with courage. So we begin. This was the title of the talk that I had that was advertised. And as you submit these things and you think about them, and I'm like, it could probably also be titled this. I could have probably also titled this talk this. Maybe even this. And so just thinking about what are the different forces that are coming in to what I'm trying to communicate. So this is a brief run through of what I will be attempting to talk about today. It's not heavily scripted. The slides are mainly for me to help sort out some of the things I might want to say so I don't get too off track. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen, if you feel like you need some kind of anchor, I've translated this menu into like a short form at the bottom with some color coding so that you don't feel like you're floating away. I will be largely reading poetry in conjunction with some images and sharing some summaries of some of the reasons why this work came to exist. Contrary to popular belief in all of the ways that one could be, I am ordinary. What follows on these pages is not a heroic narrative of superhuman resilience or experiences that only I have endured. I do not make such claims. Rather, it is precisely because I am ordinary that I am compelled to write about these things that follow on these pages. These moments I share are moments of ordinary people, moments within moments of our ordinary lives, pressing against each other, weighted contradiction, simultaneous, ordinary, tragedy, daily violence normalized under the guise that violence is not ordinary. This air we breathe is toxic, demanding ordinary resistance, ordinary violence in ordinary moments. First must be seen as such. The glorification of the narrative that violence is horrific, to be overcome by resilient, extraordinary people, sustains violence itself in at least 3 ways. And so this work takes place in what I would say kind of a trilogy of pandemics. And while there's lots of different ways to think about the violences that are currently occurring and intersecting, I choose these 3 because of how they intersect. And so the Two-Spirit Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report that was released in 2019 is, if you have not read it, I do encourage you to read it. And it is a good summary and an indication of what we mean by colonial violence. And it really does well to center what that means in terms of gender-based violence. And when I think of COVID and SARS-CoV-2 in the world of health, I think more so of the institutional responses to such pandemic and how that has left a lot of us traumatized, reeling, unable to deal with the impacts. And there's a lot there that needs to be unpacked, but the institutional responses to that has made it difficult to do that. And Pictou County is specifically referring to the Mass Casualty Commission. that was reported in 2023, and how both of these in 2020 overshadowed that which was released in 2019, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, and how those kind of took centered stage. And so what do we need to do to return to that, to think about where we need to go forward? And so just one story is in terms of my positionality, coming from the position of a sexually assaulted at work healthcare professional, filling a gap, yes, but also existing where one does not exist, between lines of thought that are not to be converged. And what do I mean by this is the literature typically looks at gender-based violence at the workplace in healthcare settings in two streams, where you are either a perpetrator or a victim. And in the perpetrator sense, there are whole bodies of regulations and institutional responses that are built to deal with that. And in the victim side, it is less so. You may have a union, or you may be able to go to the criminal legal system, but it's mostly talked about in terms of lateral violence or from a superior boss, so colleagues or boss, even though statistically, Statistics Canada has recognized that the most common source of violence is actually from patients. And so during COVID, I think there was like the height of the lockdowns, there was actually legislative changes to account for the increased level of violence that healthcare professionals were experiencing in the workplace. And so it's not unrelated to the pandemic, but it was like an acknowledgement that some of these things are happening. And I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had around those things. And so institutional response is kind of my definition, by which I mean the things that one finds that one must do for no other reason than they now must do it, until it is considered that the things have been sufficiently dealt with. And so these things that you're often put in a position where you must deal with, that is, these institutional responses, often require a response or action from you that aren't of their own accord, and I will say that they did nearly kill me. And so a desire to end domination is kind of where I found myself when I started this work. And how might I think about that in terms of a love praxis or an ethic, gut feelings and visceral logics, or ordinary violence? How do we make the familiar strange again so that we might see it for what it is and do something? And so what are my guideposts? And so this is just a brief slide. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but these are kind of the readings that I did multiple times at the start, even before I really started conceptualizing what this work was or could be, but mainly recognizing that the space that I found myself at was one that was not familiar. And so I read a lot, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, L. Jones, Leanne Betts Mosok, Saki Simpson, France Fanon, and Nitu Kana. And so these are all scholars of color who write from an anti-colonial abolitionist lens, among others. Jacques Derrida's Deconstruction, what it is also, what is not what it seems. So it is, but is also not. And so Sarah Ahmed, in terms of queer phenomenology, helped me, give me permission to start from a point of disorientation. So typically in health research, when you're thinking about all of the work that goes into crafting a research question and you have a solid kind of standing footing before you get started, Sarah helped me know that that does not necessarily have to be there to do work. And so what's my methodology, which I can think of as a map or a plan, where art is personal, is philosophical? Just one slide is where I used auto theory and research creation as two approaches to doing research that I merged together in a shared methodology. And so what is auto theory? Folks might have heard of bibliography, autobiography, autoethnography, but the difference between auto theory is that it merges theory and autobiography. And where autoethnography might be a systematic exploration of the self within a given culture, autoethnography, auto theory is more thinking about what is my relationship to theory and philosophy in terms of rewriting myself through the critical thought of theory and post-structuralist thought, specifically in my case. But instead of thinking, or that even thinking that I know what a given culture is, I'm more so concerned with like the conceptualization of where I am. And this requires a reliance on being vulnerable and intimate, which I am trying to also engage in the way that I present and talk about this work. And so research creation is an approach to research. And so the definition from Shirk I've boiled down into a few bullet points, but essentially it's a necessity to combine this academic research practices, such as what I have kind of explained on the left under auto theory, alongside an innovative approach to thinking around, and innovation is Shirk's word, around like how do we think about what we do differently with, and I do that with theory and a creative practice. And so research creation requires a returned showing up to create and make art. It is in the making that we know. And so I think of methods as movement. This is the things that we do, the rubber hits the road, the actions. And so you could think about, I think about my methods kind of writing as auto-theoretical research creation. I lead into a method, writing as a method of inquiry. And it's a creative method of inquiry where I'm bringing together work by Richardson and Pierre and Truman. And Truman does text-based research creation, and Richardson and St. Pierre use writing as a method of inquiry in a post-structuralist sense. And so together, these two disrupt the static view of writing to communicate already complete thoughts. You are not complete when you start, in comparison to when we might think of writing up or at the end where you communicate results as something that's there. You start before you know where you are going. And so it's part of the journey, and you may not actually be sure when you're done. And so I think this approach to research may not be for every question. In fact, it cannot be, but it can be something that might open up spaces and areas where there's uncertainties. And so in my case, in the world of psychological trauma, you might say where memories are ephemeral, where they're fleeting, where you don't know where you begin or end, and the violence begins or end. Something like this can lean into those spaces to try to see what is it that I might be able to do with this suffering. And so it positions writing as an activity used to think, to analyze, to uncover. And this method of inquiry, it's pulled away from anything that might attempt to take a position of authority, right? Of a static, authoritative truth. And so just at a high level, I'm not going to get like into examples of what was done, maybe. But this is, you begin with some theoretical precursors. And in my case, I was using love predominantly from Bell Hook's writing of radical love in terms of a praxis as a theoretical precursor that underlined my movement within these 5 kind of things to think about in terms of what might be a text-based research creation. And so emergence and events, it could start anywhere, but I'll start with situated speculation, where you kind of, you're looking ahead from where one is at. And so what might one want to know and create, and how might this work of creation take place? And so the way that Truman talks about it is you might have something that you're looking to learn or understand, and you start to think about what might I need to do to understand that. And in my situation, it was more, how am I meant to survive this, and what is this I am meant to survive? And so if you're thinking about research with folks who have experienced gendered and sexualized violence, that might be a question that could come up. And that means that it's in the thinking about how am I meant to survive this, and what is this I am meant to survive, is that part of that work requires figuring out what this even is, whether it's internally or around you. And so a situated speculation in the case of this work required some guessing. Rigorous activation requires a movement. And so this is a gathering, a pulling together, a curation, a picking up debris, materials, resources, artistic practices into a plan, something that starts to look like something that you might be able to do to get to something that you might want to know. And so me specifically, there was a series of crises, post-leave terms, a period of self-study, daily journal writing that I call morning pages, and a curriculum to develop an artistic practice that I drew from Julia Herman's The Artist Way as somewhere to start to teach myself how to be creative. I also enrolled in some courses at NASCAD and some community-based groups to learn how to draw and do photography. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and then I read and I read and I wrote and I read, and then I did more. And so the emergence and events as things mix in a rigorous activation, there's some kind of an alchemy, you're cooking, there's something forming, there's something new that is different than what it previously was. The raw events are no longer raw. And so this starts to kind of come together, and then you enter into like a period of affirmation and refusal. And what is this? What do I affirm? What do I refuse? Not knowing what might it mean to live with curiosity in a world that demands certainty, but what is it that I might need? And so there's still agency in here, and you can pick where you might want to follow, what you might want to take with you. And then the more than representation is the writing and the rewriting. So thinking to auto theory, where it's more than the autobiography and you're writing it with theory, that is an essential piece where then the final stage of what you were doing becomes something new in and of itself. And so I have a couple of excerpts here from, I'll call my substantive chapter. I'm just going to take a sip of water. But I spell morning pages MOURNIG because there is grief. And so this is really where I started. Working through creative doubt was done only with permission, letting myself put down whatever it was I needed, knowing only that what was needed because it was what I put down. Until loud and clear, I traced that I do have the right to invest in my creativity. I have the right to invest in my creativity. I have the right to invest in my creativity. I have the right to invest in my creativity. And some of these drawings and things that came out in the margins that were pushed off to the side eventually made their way to the center space. And that's when I started to engage more seriously in some self-portrait photography and some poetry writing. And so this is one excerpt that was on exhibit at the Des Musées Museum on the South Shore of Nova Scotia. And this is a picture of the exhibit. And so the text on the mirror for the title of the work is Make It Stop. And when I was originally taking that photo, I had a different idea, a different sketch in mind. And there was two of me in the image. I was swinging the hammer, yes, but it was originally an axe first. And second, I was also on the ground. But I didn't have those skills in Photoshop yet, or the software that I use. And so this is what it is. But is it the more mad I am, or is it the more mad I am made to be? If madness challenges our ideas of what it is to be sane, then protecting my madness is to protect my sanity. I must embrace my chaos to be whole. The madness is all around me, and the panic is making me feel. It is a wave, a surge from deep within, an imperial, capital, heteropatriarchal, ableist, white supremacist attack, period. I must make it stop. Won't let go. Adopted over time, this position hurts. Curled up, tight locked in pain. Sustaining this non-life masks the pain gnawing deep from somewhere. To survive, I trade senses for defenses. Tell me it doesn't have to be this way. I dare you. How long have I been bleeding? And I think this, to me, what this piece means is really what are the things that we hold on to even when they no longer serve us? And what might we need to let go of if we are to tend to our wounds? This is titled Breathe. What do you do when the more you feel like yourself, the more you feel like you don't belong, the more you feel alone? And I had to drink myself into rest because I refused to let myself have it. Alcohol poisoning as self-care. I suppose I needed to know that I was alive, and the only way I knew how to do that was to push my body to the limits. Just breathe, just breathe, just breathe, just breathe, just breathe, just breathe. I think you get the gist. And so this is really, I think some of the pieces that I've selected to share, I'm attempting to highlight the tension between the different labels that we are prescribed as people who may or may not have endured sexualized violence and then had to deal with the institutional responses that follow such violence in terms of these institutions that claim to have the solutions to the problems that they create also cause more harm. And so that's just a snippet. And this is a wall that was in Kentville at a guide's, at a gallery showing that I had a talk at that kind of pulled all of the different pieces together. And so what I just shared with you is a small piece. And so the art of showing up is still really in progress, and it's kind of the what does this mean and how am I bringing all this together? And so right now, this is kind of what I have for the presentation, is that really it's working at trying. And how do we continue to show up in situations where we might be tempted to not show up, to go somewhere else, to run away, whereas Sarah Ahmed would say, in a period of disorientation, when you start to realize that you are no longer going or where you think you should be going, the temptation is to hurry back, to go back to where you came from before you even know or realize or learn the possibilities of where you are or where you might be going. And so what do we lose out on when we can't let go? And this is just a brief list of some preliminary points that I'm thinking of that are nothing more than subtitles in that chapter. But if there's something in here that you're curious about and wanted to ask a question, I'm up for discussion, as it might help me write. But that's about it. And then I'll questions, thoughts, or critiques.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And I see, sorry, who has their hand? Jacqueline, you go ahead.
Hi, I'm really sorry if you hear my dogs in the background. They're rather active and vocal today. But I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you put into this and the bravery of presenting it. As I was listening, I work as a forensic nurse examiner, primarily with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And as you were speaking, so much resonated with me and what I want to do in my thesis for my master's in terms of how survivors experience seeking resources. And it really connected to me with this theory of like anger in terms of, you know, they're never the same again. So there is a grief and a mourning for the loss of who they were before and who they could have been as they try to figure out how to move on and survive. So just I love the perspective coming more from like an aesthetic and a personal and a spiritual way rather than just the scientific empirical knowledge. So just fantastic. Loved it.
That means a lot, Jacqueline. Thanks. Thank you.
Maddie.
I just also like echo what Jacqueline had said. Thank you so much for sharing. Like it's an inspiring like presentation and like just like I don't have any words to describe. Like you just really opened my perspective and the depth that can be brought through, you know, creating your path, especially in theory and in, historically maybe prescriptive ways of which you would navigate research space, like Jacqueline had mentioned, in terms of empiricism, and how do we answer questions that don't fit into that space. And you, sorry, so beautifully. And I cannot wait to read your work and see what comes from it. So thank you, Ivan.
Thanks, Maddie. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I mean, I have the privilege of reading a little bit more as I'm on Ivan's committee, but I just also want to highlight, I'm just so appreciative of the work that you are doing and how you have joined the group of scholars, researchers, activists, artists, so many there, and have been able to bring into your very complex piece of research in so many ways. And I guess I particularly love the way that you have challenged, and now you're continuing to challenge the patriarchal, heteronormative ways of doing research. So we know that exists within universities, within the institution, within research. So it, as others have said, an absolutely beautiful, but very scholarly academic also, bringing in all of that theory in so many different ways that many of us just don't do and aren't aware of. So you articulated it very well. And I think, I certainly understood what you were saying. Yeah, it just makes sense. And it offers many of us as researchers, but also I think clinicians, how we can maybe do things differently and just recognize that how do we, and I love some of the words that you said, guess, or how do we come to this space when we know something's going on? So you don't have to have that research question right at the beginning. It might materialize partway through. So you're just challenging so many things, and really, really appreciate your work.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah. Anybody else, or any last words, Ivan?
Oh, I don't know. I just threw. Yeah, I guess I was just really nervous about presenting. I guess it's kind of obvious, but also it's different every time. Like I don't know what's gonna come out, so I'm like, well, I have slides, I guess, but I don't know. Yeah, so I'm glad
Again,
that
slides are
like
prescriptive, right? Yeah. So.
yeah, I'm glad that it the visuals are necessary. So I think I'm glad. Sounds
Yeah.
like people got something out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at your next, when you have another art exhibit, just let us know and we'll advertise.
Cool.
Perfect. Okay. It is 1:00. So thank you so much, Ivan. A fantastic presentation. And thank you everyone who is here today. Thank you to both our presenters, and we look forward to reading your work, which will be coming out next year very soon. And along the way, at presentations like this. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay. Take care.